The fields of western Russia lay quiet beneath a haze of black smoke. It was the summer of 1941, and the soil that once carried wheat and sunflowers was now buried beneath steel. Across hundreds of miles, from Białystok to Smolensk, lay the carcasses of what had once been the largest armored force on Earth. Soviet T-26 light tanks, their turrets torn away, their tracks twisted and lifeless, formed a graveyard of iron. Crows circled above the wrecks, settling briefly on the scorched hatches before lifting again into the grey sky. The Red Army's dream of mechanized war had ended almost before it began. They had built them by the tens of thousands, thin-skinned, short-barreled machines meant to embody a new kind of warfare. By June of 1941, the Soviet Union possessed more tanks than the rest of the world combined. Over 23,000 armored vehicles stood on its rosters, from the aging T-26 and BT-7 to the untested KV and T-34. It was an arsenal born of ideology and fear, designed to make invasion unthinkable. Yet when the invasion came, when Operation Barbarossa thundered east with 3 million German soldiers, the empire of steel crumbled almost instantly. In the first weeks alone, more than 10,000 Soviet tanks were lost, destroyed, abandoned, or left without fuel. Entire mechanized corps vanished in hours. Some were trapped in endless columns, caught in the open by German dive bombers. Others broke down before reaching the front, their engines choking on dust, their transmissions seizing under the strain. The survivors fought blindly, often without radios, guided by smoke and instinct. Crews who had been promised victory through technology now found themselves crawling through burning grass, their world reduced to noise and heat. The T-26 was among the first victims of the new war. Designed in the early 1930s as a symbol of Soviet industrial prowess, it was already obsolete when the Germans came. Its 15mm armor could not withstand the 37mm shells of the Panzer III, nor the precision of the Luftwaffe's Stukas. The tank that had once paraded across Red Square in triumph now smoldered in silence, its vision slits shattered, its crews frozen in their seats by fire and shock. For the men who commanded them, the sight was unbearable. Soviet officers had been taught that the tank was the future, the purest expression of socialist progress. But as they walked among the wrecks, that faith began to die. The battlefield looked less like the dawn of a new mechanized era and more like the ruins of a failed experiment. Somewhere amid the haze, the Red Army began to understand that it had misunderstood the very nature of modern war. How could a nation that built more tanks than any other fall so completely? The answer lay not in numbers, but in doctrine. Soviet mechanized forces were vast but clumsy, centralized to the point of paralysis. Commanders feared initiative. Logistics were broken by secrecy and purges. The Red Army possessed power, but not flexibility, steel, but not understanding. Against the coordinated tempo of the Wehrmacht, its armored might dissolved into chaos. As night fell over the shattered plains, the temperature dropped. Crews who had escaped the burning tanks wrapped themselves in tarps and listened to the faint hum of engines retreating westward. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the German columns were still moving, relentless and ordered. The Red Army, stunned and disbelieving, gathered itself amid the wreckage of its own promise. The mechanized dream had turned to ruin, and yet, in those ruins, something began to stir. For every destroyed T-26, a lesson was being written in fire and steel. What the Germans could not see was that the same disaster that had destroyed the Soviet tank arm would also give birth to a weapon they would come to fear. The story of the Soviet tank did not begin in battle, but in belief. In the 1920s, as the smoke of civil war faded and the young Soviet state struggled to define itself, a new faith emerged from its factories. It was not a faith in men, nor in words, but in machines. Where the old empires had worshipped lineage and crown, the Soviets placed their trust in pistons, steel, and oil. In workshops along the Neva and the Volga, engineers spoke of tractors and tanks as if they were prophets of a coming age, symbols that a backward nation could leap forward through industry alone. The fields that had once been tilled by wooden plows now echoed with the clang of metal. The party called it industrialization, the people called it salvation. Machines would erase hunger, conquer distance, and defend the revolution. The same logic that drove the first Soviet tractors across barren soil would soon drive tanks across imagined battlefields. The machine became more than a tool. It became a philosophy, a promise that human will, when organized through industry, could defy history itself. In 1929, this belief found a form, a small squat vehicle with riveted armor and twin turrets, the Vickers 6-ton tank, designed in Britain. The Soviets, still years behind in military technology, saw in it both a model and a shortcut. In 1930, the USSR purchased a license from the Vickers Company and began producing its own version under a new name, the T-26. What began as an act of imitation soon became an act of conviction. Factories rose across Leningrad, each assembly line a cathedral to progress. The workers, many of them barely trained, built tanks with the same devotion their parents had once given to icons. By 1933, the Red Army fielded over 4,000 T-26, and within a decade, more than 10,000. No other nation had ever built so many tanks in peacetime. To the party, it was proof that socialism could outproduce capitalism. To the engineers, it was vindication, that the machine itself was the revolution made visible. But faith in machines often conceals fear of men. The Soviet Union of the 1930s was a country at war with its own uncertainty. Stalin's purges tore through the officer corps. Brilliant designers were arrested or disappeared. Yet production increased. Even as the prisons filled, the factories expanded. The T-26 continued to roll off the lines, its design unchanged, its doctrine unquestioned. The tank had become an article of faith, too symbolic to criticize, too numerous to rethink. In official parades, rows of T-26 rattled across Red Square, their green armor gleaming under the summer sun. Children watched with pride. Officers saluted. The voice of the announcer declared the Soviet tank the finest expression of collective genius. Few noticed that its thin plates could be pierced by a rifle at close range. In those years, appearance mattered more than endurance. What the world saw was an army of machines stretching beyond sight. What the party saw was the embodiment of destiny. Beneath the optimism, a quieter truth persisted. Soviet engineers understood the limits of their creation. They knew that its armor was thin, its engine weak, its communication poor. But to question the machine was to question the system that demanded it. So they built more. They improved production speed, not performance. The result was an army vast in number, fragile in reality, a mirror of the state itself. To the outside world, this expansion seemed unstoppable. Foreign observers in Moscow wrote of a new tank nation, a land where every problem found its solution in steel. In truth, the Soviet Union was arming itself not for conquest, but for reassurance. Each tank was a promise to itself that the revolution would not die. Each rivet was a declaration that progress could be manufactured. Yet the machine that symbolized invincibility carried within it a flaw as old as belief itself. The Soviets mistook quantity for certainty, production for power. They assumed that mass could substitute for method, that ideology could compensate for experience. It was a comforting illusion, and one that would not survive its first encounter with the German war machine. In the years to come, when the panzers crossed the border and the skies burned with dive bombers, the promise of the machine would be tested to destruction. But even as the T-26 fell in flame, another tank, born from its lessons, was already taking shape in the shadows of Kharkov. The machine had given the Soviets a symbol. Now they needed a purpose. In the decade between revolution and war, the Red Army sought not just to build tanks, but to build a philosophy of how to use them. In the marble halls of the Frunze Military Academy, under portraits of Lenin and maps of Europe, a new vision of warfare began to take shape. Its architect was a man of restless intelligence and unyielding conviction, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. He was no ordinary officer. Born into the old nobility, tempered by the revolution, Tukhachevsky believed that technology could make ideology invincible. To him, the future battlefield would no longer belong to infantry lines or cavalry charges, but to deep, mechanized penetration. Fast, coordinated, unrelenting. He called it deep battle. Its goal was not to fight the enemy where he stood, but to destroy his cohesion entirely. Tanks would spearhead the breakthrough, aircraft would isolate the rear, and mechanized infantry would pour through the gap. The war of attrition would be replaced by a war of movement, a revolution in steel. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it demanded a scale the world had never seen. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Union began forming mechanized corps, vast, self-contained armies of up to 600 tanks each, supported by artillery, engineers, and motorized infantry. Western observers watched the parades in astonishment. At maneuvers outside Moscow and Kiev, lines of T-26 and BT tanks stretched across the horizon, engines roaring in unison, dust clouds rising like smoke from a factory furnace. The spectacle seemed to confirm what Soviet propaganda proclaimed, that socialism had found the key to modern war. Cameras rolled as tank columns advanced in perfect symmetry. Posters showed them cutting through enemy lines like waves through sand. To the Soviet people, these films were proof that their nation had turned industrial strength into military certainty. To the party, they were a reassurance that faith in the machine had not been misplaced. Tanks no longer merely represented progress, they embodied destiny. But behind the camera, the truth was more fragile. The parades were carefully choreographed illusions, their order concealing deep disorder. Engines overheated in the summer dust. Radios failed, spare parts were missing. Half the tanks broke down before reaching their start lines. Fuel supplies were inconsistent, roads were poor, and maps were often inaccurate. The mechanized corps looked mighty on paper, yet in motion they fractured under their own weight. Even so, criticism was rare. Doctrine had become dogma. To question mechanization was to question the revolution's future. Soviet officers learned to repeat slogans instead of analysis. The exercises were victories before they began. Reports exaggerated successes, erased failures, and promised that next year's maneuvers would be even larger. What mattered was not performance, but the image of progress, the appearance of unstoppable force. Tukhachevsky's ideas demanded trust between command and creativity, between plan and improvisation. Yet the Soviet system, increasingly dominated by fear, could offer neither. Officers executed orders but avoided initiative. The purges of 1937 cut through the ranks like a scythe, erasing the very minds that had understood deep battle's complexity. Tukhachevsky himself was arrested, accused of treason, and executed. His vision outlived him, but hollowed, stripped of nuance, and distorted into ritual. What remained was a doctrine without understanding. The Red Army continued to expand its armored forces, convinced that more tanks meant greater strength. mechanization became an article of belief, repeated, unexamined, untested under real fire. Training manuals spoke of grand breakthroughs, but few officers had the authority to lead one. The paradox was complete. The army that had pioneered modern armored warfare no longer understood its own invention. In the late 1930s, as Europe darkened once again, Soviet tank divisions still paraded in perfect formation. Their tracks gleamed, their engines thundered, and their commanders saluted with confidence. Yet beneath the surface, the structure was brittle. The logistics that would sustain a real war were untested. The radios that would coordinate it were silent. When the first German shells fell in 1941, the dream of deep battle met reality and collapsed beneath it. But before the storm came, in the design bureaus of Kharkov and Leningrad, a handful of engineers were preparing something different, not a doctrine, but a weapon that could survive one. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union found its reflection in a tank. Small, angular, and unassuming, the T-26 was not a weapon of terror but of transformation. It rolled out of the Kirov and Voroshilov factories as both machine and metaphor, the steel embodiment of a nation that had willed itself from chaos into modernity. For the party, it was proof that the workers' state could do what the empires of old had not, build power from the furnace upward. The tank itself was modest. Its armor measured only 15 millimeters at its thickest, just enough to stop small arms fire. Its 45-millimeter gun, compact yet reliable, could defeat any light tank of its generation. Its speed, barely 16 kilometers per hour across rough ground, made it more tortoise than hare. But in 1933, none of that mattered. In the eyes of its makers, the T-26 was not a compromise, it was a triumph. Factories that once produced locomotives now turned out armor plates. Tractor designers became weapons engineers overnight. By 1935, assembly lines ran day and night beneath banners reading, "Steel is the strength of socialism." The air reeked of oil and paint. Workers, many of them women and former peasants, hammered rivets with rhythmic precision, believing that each blow strengthened the revolution. To them, every completed tank was a statement, a rolling declaration that the Soviet Union could outbuild, outthink, and outlast the capitalist world. The T-26's silhouette soon became a familiar sight across the empire. It guarded the borders of Manchuria, rolled through the snows of Finland, and thundered across the plains of Ukraine during peacetime maneuvers. Its crews called it simply the machine, a companion as temperamental as it was dependable. Inside, the air was cramped, hot in summer and frozen in winter. The engine rattled, the turret turned reluctantly, and the fumes clung to every stitch of clothing. Yet for the men who drove it, the T-26 was more than a weapon. It was participation in the Soviet dream. In those years, the Soviet Union measured progress not in comfort, but in output. To produce was to exist. To exceed quotas was to triumph. The T-26 fit this ethos perfectly. Simple, replicable, measurable. By 1939, over 10,000 had been built, forming the backbone of the world's largest armored force. In photographs and propaganda reels, they rumbled across Red Square in endless ranks, sunlight gleaming from their riveted armor. The announcer's voice declared them invincible, the vanguard of a proletarian army destined to reshape history. But history has little patience for perfection, frozen in time. The T-26 was born of the world of 1930, and the world was changing faster than its steel could be reshaped. Warfare was accelerating. Radios, sloped armor, and speed had begun to redefine survival. Yet within the Soviet hierarchy, success was measured by volume, not innovation. To admit obsolescence was to risk suspicion. So the production continued. While German engineers refined their panzers with precision optics and new alloys, Soviet factories produced more of the same, repeating the logic that quantity would conquer quality. The result was paradoxical, an army that appeared modern but was built upon yesterday's ideas. Each T-26 added to the illusion of preparedness, while silently deepening its fragility. Still, there was beauty in its purpose. The tank's riveted plates, the hum of its engine, the resilience of its crews, all testified to a nation's determination to transform weakness into strength. It fought in Spain during the Civil War, where Republican soldiers nicknamed it the Soviet Miracle. For a time, it was exactly that, a weapon that turned industrial theory into battlefield reality. But by 1941, that miracle had faded. The armor that once symbolized progress now stood as a relic, outmatched by a faster, deadlier generation of machines. In the dawn light of Operation Barbarossa, the T-26s burned by the hundreds. Their rivets burst like fireworks under impact. Their thin armor melted under German high-velocity shells. For their crews, there was no shame in the defeat, only the grim understanding that their weapon had belonged to a different world. The T-26 had done what it was built to do, carry a nation through its adolescence, but it could go no further. Progress had overtaken its creator, and the very symbol of Soviet industrial pride became a monument to the dangers of believing that production alone could shape destiny. Yet in laboratories far from the front, new designers were already questioning that faith, seeking not just more tanks, but better ones, machines that could think, adapt, and survive. War came to Europe not with an invasion, but with an experiment. In the summer of 1936, Spain, fractured by ideology, poverty, and pride, became the proving ground for the weapons of the next World War. It was a conflict fought between neighbors, but watched by nations. For the Soviet Union, the Spanish Civil War was more than a struggle between left and right. It was a laboratory of steel. The Kremlin saw in Spain a chance to test its theories and its machines under real fire. Hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and advisors were shipped under secrecy across the Mediterranean, disguised as agricultural equipment. Among them were the first combat-ready T-26 tanks, their green paint still smelling of the factory floor. They landed in Cartagena and were driven north to defend the Spanish Republic against the rising tide of fascism. In the autumn of 1936, near Madrid, they met their first enemy. The opposing forces, nationalist troops supported by German Panzer Thermurns and Italian CV-33 tanks, advanced confidently, unaware of what awaited them. The T-26, with its 45mm gun, could destroy them at ranges beyond the enemy's reach. In the olive groves outside the capital, the first Soviet crews opened fire. The results were devastating. German and Italian tanks burned quickly, their thin armor no match for Soviet shells. The defenders cheered as steel beasts of fascism turned to wrecks among the trees. For a time, the T-26 reigned supreme. It was faster than its propaganda had claimed, and deadlier than its rivals expected. Spanish soldiers called it El Tanqueto Invencible, the invincible little tank. In those early battles, it seemed to fulfill every promise made by Soviet engineers and propagandists alike. The machine had become a prophet of victory. But war is a patient teacher. Each triumph conceals a question. Each victory plants a seed of complacency. In Spain, the lessons of the future were written clearly, but they were not read. The T-26 performed brilliantly only when conditions favored it. Firm ground, short engagements, clear communication. When the battles dragged on, those same virtues turned to flaws. Engines overheated in the dust. Fuel ran dry. Spare parts were impossible to find. and when German aircraft appeared above the battlefield, the thin armor that had once deflected rifle fire now became a coffin. The Soviet crews, fighting far from home, learned this the hard way. They watched their comrades perish, not from enemy tanks, but from the sky. Dive bombers struck without warning, and the T-26, slow, lightly armored, and without anti-air protection, could only scatter. The war that had begun as a duel of machines had evolved into a test of coordination and speed. The Soviet Union, however, saw only what it wished to see. Reports sent back to Moscow were optimistic. Victories were exaggerated, losses minimized. Photographs showed rows of captured fascist tanks and smiling Republican soldiers beside their Soviet machines. What went unspoken was that each success had depended on isolated conditions that could not be repeated on the vast plains of the Soviet frontier. Among the few who understood this was a quiet group of officers and engineers who noted the growing gap between design and doctrine. They saw that mobility mattered more than mass, that communication mattered more than courage. Radios were scarce in Soviet tanks. Orders were still given by flag or hand signal. The Red Army had achieved tactical success, but it had not yet learned strategic humility. By 1938, the T-26 had fought in dozens of engagements across Spain. It remained the most powerful tank on the battlefield, but no longer the most decisive. Air power, logistics, and training had begun to outweigh armor and guns. For every column of burning Panzers, there were Soviet tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, or destroyed while retreating under the open sky. When the war ended in 1939, the Spanish Republic lay in ruins. The Soviet Union withdrew its advisors, convinced that its armor had proven itself against fascism, and in a narrow sense, it had. The T-26 had outgunned its enemies, and Soviet tactics had shown flashes of brilliance. But victory, as always, spoke only half the truth. Spain had whispered warnings about mobility, air superiority, and the fragility of centralized command. Yet Moscow heard only the echo of triumph. The Red Army returned home believing that it possessed not just a capable tank, but a perfect one. What they did not know was that their next opponent would study Spain's battlefields even more carefully and turn every Soviet strength into a weakness. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union stood at the height of its industrial confidence and on the edge of its own destruction. The factories were busier than ever, the furnaces hotter, the output greater. Trains carried tanks by the thousands toward depots along the western frontier. The party called it readiness. The people called it progress. Yet beneath the surface, a quieter machinery was at work, one that produced not weapons, but fear. In 1937, as Stalin's paranoia reached its zenith, the state turned its guns inward. The Great Purge began as a whisper of suspicion and ended as a roar that consumed the very men who had built the Red Army's future. Commanders, engineers, strategists, those who had dared to think differently, were arrested, interrogated, and erased. Among the first was Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the visionary of mechanized warfare. His name, once spoken with reverence in military academies, vanished from the rolls overnight. Accused of treason and conspiracy, he was executed after a secret trial. No evidence survived him, only the silence that followed. With his death, the doctrine of deep battle, the idea that mobility, coordination, and shock could win a modern war, was buried beneath the weight of obedience. The purges spread like infection through the officer corps. Between 1937 and 1939, roughly 35,000 officers were dismissed, imprisoned, or shot. Of the Red Army's top commanders, nearly 3 out of 4 disappeared. Some were executed, others perished in labor camps, Most were replaced by men who understood one thing above all: submission. The Red Army that would one day face the Wehrmacht was not the army of thinkers and reformers envisioned in the early 1930s. It was an army that had learned to fear its own reflection. In the design bureaus and tank factories, the atmosphere was no different. Engineers who once argued over armor thickness or engine design now spoke in guarded tones. To propose an innovation was to risk suspicion. To question production targets was to invite an investigation. The T-26 continued to roll off the lines, the blueprints unchanged, as if the machine itself had been frozen in time. Quantity masked stagnation. Each tank built was another illusion of progress. In official reports, nothing had changed. The statistics glowed with triumph. The 5-year plans were declared complete. Soviet newspapers published photographs of smiling workers beside rows of new tanks, their hands raised in salute. Yet inside the workshops, something vital had gone missing: the freedom to think. It was a paradox Stalin could not see. The Soviet Union had created the largest armored force in the world, but in destroying the minds that understood how to use it, he had turned that force into a hollow monument. The Red Army's strength was still measured in numbers, divisions, vehicles, shells, but the soul of innovation had been replaced by the machinery of obedience. Fear became the unspoken doctrine. Officers learned to follow orders without question. Engineers learned to repeat designs without improvement. The army became a reflection of the state that commanded it: vast, disciplined, and deeply uncertain. By 1939, the Soviet Union appeared invincible on paper. Its borders bristled with new tanks, its factories pulsed with industrial rhythm. But in the minds of its soldiers and leaders, something essential had withered. The machine still moved, but it no longer thought. A machine without thought is only motion, and motion without direction is disaster waiting to begin. And when war finally came from the West, it would strike not only at Soviet armor, but at the very emptiness that fear had built within it. By the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union had become a factory of giants. The rhythm of its furnaces, the clang of its presses, the echo of steel against concrete. These were the sounds of a nation building its faith in metal. Across the industrial heartlands of Leningrad, Kharkov, and Stalingrad, the machinery of progress roared day and night. And from those lines, one shape emerged more than any other: the low, riveted silhouette of the T-26. In 1939, Soviet records boasted more than 10,000 of them in service, an armored force larger than that of all Western Europe combined. Photographs showed endless rows of tanks gliding past reviewing stands, their turrets gleaming under the summer sun, their crews saluting as banners fluttered overhead. To the watching world, and to the Soviet people themselves, this was proof that industrial socialism had delivered what it promised: the ability to outbuild fear itself. Factories became cathedrals of ideology. In Leningrad, the Kirov plant poured out tank hulls as fast as it could forge the steel to shape them. The slogans painted above the workshops were not technical, but spiritual. Production is victory. Steel is the soul of the people. In this new theology, the T-26 was both idol and offering, a sacrifice to the idea that mass could substitute for mastery. Each tank that rolled from the assembly line added to the illusion of security. On paper, the Red Army appeared unstoppable. Thousands of light tanks stood ready on the western frontier, arranged in massive formations that looked, at least in theory, capable of overwhelming any invader. But numbers conceal as much as they reveal. Beneath the surface of those impressive totals lay a quiet truth. The tanks were many, but the means to use them were few. Maintenance was poor. Spare parts were scarce. Of the 10,000 T-26 in inventory, only a fraction could move under their own power. Engines failed, transmissions cracked, and the crews, poorly trained and under-equipped, often abandoned their machines long before combat began. The illusion of strength was maintained not by readiness, but by arithmetic. The Red Army counted its tanks by the thousands, even if half of them sat silent in depots, rusting beneath tarpaulins. Still, the illusion had its uses. To Stalin's government, the statistics were not lies. They were symbols. They told a story of transformation, a narrative of power that erased the trauma of backwardness. In the 1920s, Russia had been a land of horses and carts. By 1939, it was a nation of tractors and tanks. That the tanks might fail in war mattered less than that they existed in peace. Propaganda films turned production into spectacle. Cameras followed columns of T-26 as they crossed rivers, crushed fences, and plowed through mock villages. Children in factory towns were told that their fathers' tanks could roll all the way to Berlin if they were ever needed. In truth, few could roll even to the border. But the point was not the machine. It was the myth. The Red Army, stripped of its visionary commanders by the purges, no longer questioned these myths. Doctrine had hardened into repetition. Tanks would attack en masse, overwhelm by quantity, and crush by weight. Deep battle, the art of coordination and movement, had been forgotten. In its place stood a simpler equation: more equals stronger. It was an equation that would hold until it met an enemy who understood how to make less mean more. Yet to walk the factory floors in those years was to feel awe. The workers, many of them barely out of adolescence, labored with conviction. Sparks flew in sheets of orange light. Molten metal poured from crucibles like liquid dawn. They believed, sincerely, that they were building the peace their parents had been denied. For them, the tanks were not illusions, but hope made solid. Hope, however, cannot stop a bullet, and faith, once untested, can become the most fragile armor of all. The Soviet Union entered the new decade unarmed with confidence, but unarmored by understanding. They had built strength that looked like power, and mistook the appearance for the substance, and when the storm finally broke from the west, it would reveal how thin that armor truly was. The first snow fell like ash. In November of 1939, Soviet tanks crossed into Finland under a sky of iron and silence. The campaign was supposed to last 2 weeks. The Red Army, with its thousands of tanks and millions of men, was expected to crush a nation of barely 4 million. On paper, the outcome was certain. In the forests and frozen lakes of Karelia, certainty met reality and froze solid. The T-26, pride of the Soviet Armored Corps, led the invasion. Rows of them advanced through birch forests and across narrow roads carved between ice and swamp. Their green paint faded to white beneath frost, their engines coughing in the sub-zero air. For the first time, the Soviet tank arm faced not theory or exercise, but resistance, determined, disciplined, and invisible. The Finns did not meet the tanks head-on. They let them pass, then struck from the trees. Small teams carrying Molotov cocktails, simple bottles of fuel and flame, attacked from above and behind. Fire crawled across the thin armor, seeping into vents and engine grills. The T-26, with its 15 millimeters of steel, could withstand bullets but not burning air. One by one, the tanks stopped moving, their crews forced to choose between freezing and fire. What had been conceived as an offensive of speed became a nightmare of immobility. The tanks sank in snowdrifts, their tracks locked in ice. Lubricants thickened, fuel froze, and engines refused to start. Radios failed in the cold. Columns lost formation, their routes blocked by felled trees and hidden mines. Soviet soldiers advanced without maps, their supply lines stretched and uncertain. Against them stood an army that knew every forest path, every hill, every frozen river crossing. By January 1940, hundreds of Soviet tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. Finnish reports estimated over 1,600 armored vehicles lost during the campaign, most of them T-26. The Red Army's mechanized might, built across a decade of industrial labor, now lay scattered across the white silence of the Karelian Isthmus. For the first time, the Soviet Union's faith in its own machines faced the cold test of consequence, and yet, in Moscow, the war was not seen as a warning. It was viewed as inconvenience. Reports from the front, filled with accounts of freezing engines and fuel shortages, were rewritten in the language of optimism. Commanders who spoke of tactical failures were replaced. Official communiques declared progress. Newspapers printed images of advancing columns and smiling crews, omitting the fact that most of those tanks had stopped before the photographs were taken. To Stalin, the war's outcome seemed to justify the illusion. In March of 1940, Finland agreed to cede territory, and the Soviet Union claimed victory. But victory can be the most dangerous disguise of failure. The Red Army's losses were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of men dead, thousands of vehicles destroyed, and doctrine left in ruins. Behind every statistic lay a simple truth. The system had succeeded only by exhausting itself. The lessons were written clearly in the snow. The T-26 was too slow, too thin, too fragile for the wars to come. Soviet command structures were rigid, communication chaotic, leadership hesitant. The machine had failed not because it was weak, but because it was worshipped. In a world changing faster than its armor could be thickened, the Soviet Union still mistook quantity for adaptability and obedience for strength. But the warnings from Finland went unheeded. The purges had taught officers to fear their own insight. Those who suggested redesigns or new doctrines were labeled defeatists. To admit weakness was to risk disappearance, so the reports were buried, the photographs locked away, the lessons forgotten. The Red Army celebrated its hard-won victory and learned nothing from it. In the months that followed, Soviet tanks rolled back into their depots, their paint still scarred by fire. Mechanics patched them, repainted them, and sent them westward once again. On parade, they gleamed like new. In the archives, they were counted as operational. Only the men who had fought in Finland knew the truth, that the empire of steel could break just as easily as ice. The war that should have humbled the Soviet Union had instead reaffirmed its pride. And pride, uncorrected, becomes prophecy. Because in the summer of 1941, when the next war came, it would not forgive illusions. It would expose them. At dawn on June 26, 1941, the eastern horizon lit up, not with sunrise but with fire. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the German army crossed the border into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, had begun. More than 3 million German soldiers, supported by 600,000 vehicles and 3,500 aircraft, surged eastward in 3 massive thrusts. For the Red Army, it was a moment they had expected in theory, but not in truth. Along the frontier, in fields still wet with morning dew, thousands of T-26 tanks stood in rows. Many were covered in tarps, their crews asleep beside them. They were the same tanks that had paraded through Red Square, the same machines that had burned in Finland, and now the same that would meet the German panzers. Soviet records counted 10,268 T-26 in service that morning, more tanks than existed in all other armies combined. On paper, the Soviet Union possessed the greatest armored force the world had ever seen. But paper cannot think. The attack came without warning. Dive bombers screamed down on airfields, turning runways into infernos. Fuel depots erupted in columns of black smoke. Communications vanished in minutes. By sunrise, the Red Army's frontline tank units were fighting blind. Some crews received no orders at all. Others were told to counterattack against enemies they could not locate. The vast machine Stalin had built to terrify the world now stumbled in the dark. Columns of T-26 rolled forward anyway, slowly, stubbornly, engines coughing through clouds of dust and heat. Many had no radios. They communicated by flags or by memory. Commanders leaned from open hatches, shouting over the roar of engines. The tanks advanced in scattered waves, their once precise formations broken by chaos. They moved forward as if quantity could delay destiny. The first encounters came near Białystok, Grodno, and Lida. Against German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, the T-26 were outmatched in every dimension: speed, armor, communication, coordination. Their 45mm guns could still pierce German armor at close range, but few survived long enough to get that close. German units struck with precision, guided by radio networks and supported from the air. Soviet crews fought bravely but blindly, unaware that their isolated battles were already part of a larger collapse. Within days, entire mechanized corps ceased to exist. The 6th, 11th, and 12th Mechanized Corps, once symbols of Soviet strength, were reduced to fragments. Tanks ran out of fuel and ammunition. Crews abandoned their vehicles, blowing them up with grenades to prevent capture. Fields once filled with engines now lay silent, the grass blackened with oil and fire. What had begun as doctrine now became tragedy. The T-26, once the proof of Soviet progress, had become its symbol of ruin. Its riveted armor, designed in another era, could not withstand modern shells. Its slow engines, built for parades and exercises, stalled under combat strain. Its crews, many barely trained, faced an enemy who had already studied their weaknesses in Spain and Finland. The Germans, advancing with confidence, could hardly believe what they saw. Thousands of Soviet tanks destroyed or abandoned within the first week. In the air, the Luftwaffe hunted the survivors. On the ground, panzer divisions encircled them with frightening efficiency. By early July, more than 6,000 T-26 were lost. Those that remained were scattered, operating in pockets, or hidden in forests, awaiting fuel that would never come. For the Soviet soldiers who survived, the defeat was not only material, it was existential. They had been told that steel and numbers would protect them. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by wreckage that mirrored their illusions. The machine they trusted had failed because it had been built on faith, not function. And yet, even amid disaster, something endured. Soviet crews who escaped destruction often fought on foot, joining partisan units or retreating eastward to regroup. Behind them, in factories far beyond the Urals, a new generation of engineers worked in silence. Among them were the men of Kharkov, already designing a tank that could do what the T-26 never could: move, think, and survive in the war that had only just begun. The T-26 had carried a dream into the fires of reality, and there, in the first week of Barbarossa, that dream was burned away, leaving only the need for something stronger, simpler, and entirely new. In the ruins of the Red Army's first defense, a different tank waited in the shadows, one that would soon redefine the very meaning of power. By the second week of the German invasion, the front no longer existed as a line. It had become a storm. Soviet tank brigades, designed for offense, now found themselves scattered across the plains of Belarus and Ukraine, swallowed by dust and confusion. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Roads that once led west were clogged with refugees, burning fuel convoys, and wrecked machines. The Red Army had been built for a war of theory. It was now fighting a war of reality. The panzer divisions, moving with terrifying precision, struck deep into the Soviet rear. Each column was a spear point, coordinated by radio, reinforced by the air. The Luftwaffe circled overhead like hawks, striking not only the tanks, but everything that fed them: bridges, fuel depots, and supply lines. For the Soviet armored forces, there was no sanctuary. When the T-26 did move forward, they moved into ambush. When they tried to retreat, they ran out of fuel. The battlefield itself turned against them. Engines seized under the summer heat. Thin armor cracked beneath the impact of 37mm and 50mm shells. Those who survived the first barrage often died in the second, trapped in machines that had no time to cool. Crews fought to the last round, then destroyed their own tanks with grenades to keep them from the enemy. In the charred fields of Białystok, Smolensk, and Minsk, Soviet tankmen left behind blackened hulks, mute witnesses to a faith undone. By mid-July, German maps told the story more clearly than any speech could. The Soviet mechanized corps, once counted by the dozen, had become ghost formations. The 6th Mechanized Corps, fielding over 1,000 tanks in June, reported fewer than 50 operational vehicles a month later. The 8th Corps vanished entirely. By August, over 75% of all T-26 in European Russia were gone, not just destroyed, but abandoned, their engines lifeless, their treads half buried in dust. It was not only the enemy that destroyed them. The Red Army destroyed itself through the weight of its own illusions. The vastness of its arsenal had become a burden. Too many machines, too few mechanics, too little coordination. Tanks without fuel were left on the roadside. Others were cannibalized for spare parts. Crews who could not fight walked eastward, carrying only their rifles and the memory of their machines. From the air, the scale of the disaster was visible even to the enemy. German reconnaissance pilots described miles of wreckage, columns of burnt-out Soviet armor stretching beyond the horizon. Some tanks lay where they had been hit. Others stood in neat lines, abandoned without a fight, their hatches open to the wind. It was a sight both triumphant and haunting. For the Germans, it was proof of victory. For history, it was proof of hubris. Inside the Kremlin, reports filtered in with unbearable speed. Each one was a contradiction. Hundreds of tanks lost, yet more still listed as operational on paper. Stalin refused to believe the full scale of the destruction. He had built an empire of numbers, and now the numbers betrayed him. The machines he had trusted, the ones meant to guarantee security, had vanished in a matter of weeks. For the men on the ground, the war became silence. Entire units disappeared without trace. Tank commanders who had once believed in the certainty of steel now fought on foot, surrounded by fields of twisted metal that still steamed from battle. There was no time for grief, only motion, eastward, always eastward, as the Wehrmacht advanced. And yet, amid the wreckage, something changed. In defeat, the illusions burned away. The Red Army began to see not what it had built, but what it needed to become. Officers who survived the chaos took note of what failed: the radios, the armor, the fuel, the doctrine. Out of that ruin, a grim clarity began to form. It was not defeat in battle, it was revelation. The Soviet Union had learned in a single catastrophic summer the cost of mistaking movement for direction and quantity for power. The empire of tanks had fallen, but in its ashes, a new idea was beginning to take shape, one forged not from pride, but from necessity. And deep within the factories east of the Urals, a new tank was already being assembled. one that would turn revelation into revenge. When the smoke began to clear, the land itself seemed to bear witness. Across the steppe lay the skeletal remains of an army, turrets twisted toward the sky, hulls half buried in dust, the paint blistered by heat and time. Between them moved silent figures in worn uniforms, clipboard in hand, measuring, noting, collecting. They were not mourners, they were students of catastrophe. In the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union was a nation of contradictions, vast in size, yet fragile in organization, rich in machines, yet poor in understanding. The war had torn the curtain from illusion. The Red Army, which had once claimed invincibility, now confronted its own reflection in the burned-out husks of T-26 and BT-7s scattered from Minsk to Smolensk. Among the wreckage, officers and engineers began to ask questions no one had dared to voice before. Why had the tanks failed? Why had the formations collapsed so completely? The answers did not come easily. They emerged slowly, painfully, from the wrecks themselves. Burn marks traced where armor had been too thin. Radios, smashed and silent, told of commands never heard. Engines, seized with sand and neglect, spoke of a logistics system designed for parades, not for war. Every destroyed tank became a teacher. Crews who survived explained how their units had entered battle blind. No reconnaissance, no coordination, no air cover. Tank battalions had advanced as islands, cut off from one another by distance and confusion. Fuel convoys had been bombed before reaching the front. Ammunition, often of mismatched calibers, arrived days late or not at all. What the Soviets discovered in their own ruins was not simply weakness, it was disconnection. The machine and the man had been built separately and asked to fight together. At field depots hastily established east of Moscow, captured and destroyed tanks were disassembled for study. Engineers examined every angle of penetration, every shattered weld, every melted gear. They compared these scars with German tanks recovered intact and realized, perhaps for the first time, that technology was only one part of survival. The other was unity between design, doctrine, and decision. The Germans had not been stronger in steel. They had been stronger in thought. It was a revelation paid for in blood. Soviet commanders who had survived the encirclements began to write new reports, blunt, unflinching, often unsigned. They spoke of command systems too rigid, of officers too frightened to act without permission, of tank crews trained to obey rather than to think. These reports were dangerous, yet necessary. They circulated quietly among the surviving staff officers, the seeds of a new doctrine not yet spoken aloud. Inside the factories relocated beyond the Urals, engineers read those same reports. They worked through the nights in workshops lit by lanterns, surrounded by the remnants of machines that had failed. They took note of every shortcoming, the brittle armor, the exposed fuel lines, the unreliable gearboxes, and began to design something different, a tank that could survive the world as it was, not as ideology imagined it to be. In that crucible of loss, humility took root. For a system that had long equated error with treason, to admit failure was an act of courage. Yet it was precisely that courage, the willingness to see truth in wreckage, that began to reshape the Red Army. Officers learned to delegate. Engineers began to innovate. Factories built for display, now built for endurance. The Soviet Union had lost nearly everything, and in doing so, had gained the one thing it had never truly possessed: perspective. The lessons were brutal, but they endured. Maps of the front were redrawn not by generals in offices, but by engineers in workshops. They no longer counted success in numbers of tanks produced, but in those that returned from battle. Slowly, painfully, The Red Army began to turn knowledge into survival. Every wrecked tank was a fragment of knowledge paid for in blood. And in the quiet after the storm, those fragments began to form a pattern, a vision of what might yet rise from the ruins. Because even as the T-26 lay silent across the plains, another machine, born from its lessons, was beginning to move. The winter of 1941 did not bring victory, but it brought survival, and with it, a change of mind. What the Soviet Union had failed to achieve through numbers, it would now pursue through learning. The shock of Barbarossa had burned away illusion. What remained was discipline, endurance, and a slow, hard awakening to reality. The first sign of that awakening came from the east, from the factories that had been uprooted and reassembled beyond the Ural Mountains. These were not the same workshops that had once built the T-26. The banners were gone, the slogans replaced by silence. Engineers worked in sheepskin coats, drawing blueprints with gloved hands while frost formed on the inside of the windows. They were not building for ideology now. They were building for survival. Out of that frozen exile came something new, a tank that reflected not belief, but adaptation. The T-34, born from the ashes of the T-26, carried the lessons of every destroyed machine before it. It was faster, with wide tracks to cross mud and snow. Its sloped armor could deflect shells that would have pierced the old designs. Its 76mm gun gave it the power to meet the German Panzer III and IV on equal terms. It was not perfect, but it was enough, a weapon of resilience rather than pride. Alongside it rolled the KV series, massive and defiant, capable of absorbing punishment far beyond anything its predecessor could withstand. Together, they marked a transformation not just in machinery, but in mindset. The Red Army, once obsessed with mass, began to value quality. Doctrine evolved from blind advance to calculated engagement. Radio systems became standard. Coordination replaced chaos. For the first time, Soviet tank commanders could speak to one another and act as a single organism rather than scattered limbs. The change was not immediate, nor was it easy. The battles of 1942 still bore the scars of the old ways, wasted offensives, miscommunication, and staggering losses. But beneath the repetition of tragedy, something subtle was happening. Commanders learned from failure rather than hiding it. Engineers adjusted their designs based on reports from the front. Production teams introduced simplifications not for propaganda, but for efficiency. The Soviet war machine, once paralyzed by fear of error, began to accept error as instruction. Each setback became a source of information. Each destroyed tank became a map of improvement. And in this quiet evolution lay the seeds of transformation. At Stalingrad, the first proof appeared. T-34s fought house by house, factory by factory, not as symbols but as tools. Their crews understood their machines and used them with precision. Against the German Sixth Army, which still believed in the supremacy of planning and momentum, the Soviets now fought with patience, absorbing blows, then countering with brutal efficiency. When the encirclement closed in December 1942, it was not just a tactical triumph. It was the moment when learning had overtaken illusion. The war had turned. Slowly, painfully, the Red Army had begun to think again. The same organization that once executed its visionaries was now forced to revive their ideas. Decentralized command, flexible response, and armored coordination. Factories that once produced illusions now forged redemption. The T-34 became more than a tank. It became a language, simple enough for mass production, strong enough for endurance, and adaptable enough to survive. Crews learned to repair it in the field. Supply lines grew more efficient. The Red Army that had stumbled in 1941 was gone. In its place stood an army that learned faster than it bled. By 1943, at Kursk, the transformation was complete. When the German Tiger and Panther tanks entered the field, they met not confusion, but comprehension. Soviet formations no longer advanced blindly into destruction. They maneuvered, coordinated, and counterattacked with precision born of suffering. What had once been chaos now operated like instinct, learned not in classrooms, but in the crucible of loss. The lesson was written not in doctrine or theory, but in the soil itself. The same earth that had swallowed the T-26 now carried the T-34 toward victory. The Soviet Union had not forgotten its illusions. It had buried them, beneath the snow, beneath the steel, beneath the weight of its own awakening. And in that awakening, the balance of the war began to shift, because learning, once begun, cannot be unlearned. By the middle of the war, the Soviet Union had become something it had never been before, an organism that could think while it built. The chaos of 1941 had not been erased, it had been absorbed. From the ashes of defeat emerged an understanding that power was not measured in numbers, but in comprehension. The T-26 had died, but in its death it had left behind a blueprint for survival. In the factories east of the Urals, production no longer echoed the slogans of the 5-year plans. It followed rhythm instead, the rhythm of necessity, of understanding. Assembly lines that once produced confusion now produced coordination. Steel entered at one end, and at the other rolled a machine whose every component had a purpose, whose design had been stripped of vanity. The Soviet Union was learning what the West had long known, that machines win wars only when guided by reason. By 1943, this awakening had become visible. The T-34 rolled from the lines at Nizhny Tagil, Chelyabinsk, and Omsk in numbers that defied belief. Thousands every month, each one simpler to build than the last, each one a refinement of experience written in steel. The workers who assembled them no longer built to quotas, but to comprehension. Welders knew why an armor plate was sloped. Mechanics understood why a turret ring needed clearance. Industrial production had become an act of collective intelligence. This was not the same state that had once buried innovation beneath ideology. It was a nation forced by necessity to think collectively, to make efficiency its creed. Logistics became its new faith. Trains ran on clockwork schedules across Siberia, carrying not only tanks, but spare parts, ammunition, and fuel. New depots rose behind the lines, organized not by command, but by calculation. The Red Army, once crippled by the paralysis of central control, now moved through a vast, rational network of industry that pulsed like a living heart. It was not a transformation born of genius, but of endurance. The Soviet Union did not innovate because it could. It innovated because it had to. Each destroyed tank, each lost convoy, had taught a lesson that no theory could replace. The war had become a laboratory, and its experiments were paid for in blood. The result was an industrial ecosystem capable of fighting a long war, a war not of belief, but of production balanced with intelligence. In the training grounds outside Sverdlovsk and Kazan, new tank crews drilled under doctrines that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. They learned communication first, movement second, firepower third. Radios became as vital as armor. Crews practiced coordinated strikes, ambushes, withdrawals. Officers no longer quoted ideology. They studied geometry, logistics, and probability. The Soviet war machine had discovered that discipline was not the opposite of intelligence, but its servant. And in this discipline lay the strength that had once eluded them. The same workers who had built illusions now built endurance. The same commanders who once obeyed, blindly now improvised intelligently. What had begun as obedience had evolved into understanding. This was the true revolution of the Soviet war effort, not in ideology, but in the quiet acceptance of complexity. By late 1943, the balance of war had shifted irreversibly. The factories of the Urals were producing more tanks, more aircraft, more shells than Germany could replace. But unlike in 1939, this was not an empire of illusion. Every unit that left the assembly line had a place, a function, a chain of supply. For the first time in its history, Soviet industry and Soviet strategy moved in concert. The mind had finally caught up to the muscle. It was a transformation invisible to those who sought glory in battlefields, but obvious to those who studied ledgers and timetables. The real victory of the Soviet Union was not won at Kursk or Stalingrad, but in the unlit factories where precision replaced propaganda. There, in the steady hum of machines, the nation learned that survival required thought, that even steel must be reasoned into strength. The T-26 had once been the symbol of belief without understanding. The T-34 and the system that sustained it became the proof that understanding could rise from ruin. The Soviet Union had found its balance, not through fear, not through faith, but through the sober arithmetic of necessity. And in that balance, it discovered the one truth the early dreamers of mechanized war had forgotten. Machines win only when guided by reason. Long after the noise of engines faded, the men who had driven them were forgotten. No monuments marked their graves. No songs carried their names. The tankers of the T-26, boys in steel boxes sent against a storm they could not comprehend, were the first to face the modern battlefield and the first to be consumed by it. They came from every corner of the Soviet Union, from villages along the Volga, from the streets of Leningrad, from the fields of Ukraine. Many had never seen a tank until the day they climbed inside one. Their training lasted weeks, sometimes days. They were taught to drive, to fire, to obey. They were told that the machine they rode was invincible, and they believed it, because belief was all they had. In the first hours of Operation Barbarossa, they went forward without hesitation. Columns of T-26 rolled into the fire, engines rattling, armor trembling under the shock of artillery. They advanced as they had been taught, together, without retreat, without question. Some reached the enemy lines and fought bravely, trading shots with German panzers until their guns overheated. Most never reached that far. When the ammunition ran out, they fought on foot. Some destroyed their own tanks to keep them from capture. Others stayed inside, waiting for orders that would never come. The steel that had promised safety became a tomb. For many, their war lasted less than a day. The survivors carried the memory differently. Those who escaped the burning machines went on to fight again, in infantry units, in partisans, in the new armored divisions that would rise from the ruins. They remembered not glory, but confusion, the silence on the radio, the smoke that blinded their sights, the orders that made no sense. And yet, in their loss, they gave something that statistics could never record: experience. The Red Army learned through their deaths what doctrine and ideology had refused to teach. Every burned-out T-26 was a lesson written in fire, that courage alone could not overcome isolation, that machines without thought were only moving coffins, that faith must be guided by understanding. Their sacrifice became the unspoken foundation upon which later victories were built. In 1943, when the new T-34s rolled across the steppe, many of the men commanding them were veterans of the early disaster. They had seen the price of ignorance, and they fought differently because of it. They trusted their crews. They adapted. They survived. When they spoke of the war, they rarely spoke of revenge. They spoke of remembering, of those who had gone first, and too soon. Today, Few remember the T-26 crews by name. Their machines lie buried beneath forests, beneath fields, beneath decades of silence. Rusted fragments appear sometimes in the soil. A hatch, a track link, a twisted gun barrel. Relics not of failure, but of beginnings. The men who served them were not defeated by the enemy, but by the world's first lesson in mechanized war. They fought not in vain, but too soon, and through them the Red Army learned to see. The knowledge that would one day bring victory, the understanding of how men and machines must move as one, was paid for by those who never lived to see it. Their story is not of triumph, but of transformation. The T-26 may have been obsolete, but the men inside it were not. They were the first generation of armored soldiers in a world still learning what that meant, the first to trust their lives to steel, and the first to discover how fragile steel could be. And though history forgot their names, every tank that came after carried their memory within its armor, silent proof that progress is written in the courage of those who never returned. The story of the T-26 is not one of failure. It is one of revelation. It began as a triumph of industry, a promise that steel and ideology could shape destiny. It ended as a field of wreckage stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, each burned-out hull a fragment of a single truth, that machines, no matter how many, cannot think for the men who build them. When the T-26 first rolled from the Leningrad factories, it represented everything the Soviet Union wanted to believe about itself, a nation reborn through labor, united by will, protected by progress. In its rivets and armor plates lay the certainty of a new age, that history could be engineered, that human weakness could be outproduced. But history resists design. The same industrial strength that gave the T-26 life would also condemn it, because the system that built it prized obedience over understanding. The machine itself was never the flaw. It fought bravely in Spain, in Finland, in the desperate fields of 1941. Its gun was sharp, its armor thin, its crews determined. The flaw lay in the faith surrounding it, the belief that mass could substitute for mastery, and that certainty could stand in for wisdom. The Soviet Union had built an army of metal, but silenced the minds that should have guided it. When the storm of Barbarossa came, the T-26 was not merely destroyed, it was exposed. It revealed the weakness of doctrine, the cost of arrogance, the fragility of a system that mistook statistics for strength. In a single summer, 10,000 tanks vanished, and with them, a decade of illusion. The Soviets did not lose those machines because they were weak. They lost them because they were certain. Yet within that certainty lay the seed of transformation. The Red Army learned painfully that victory demanded more than production. It demanded thought, the ability to question, to adapt, to learn. The death of the T-26 became the birth of something greater, a war machine tempered by understanding rather than ideology. Its wrecks, half buried in soil and snow, became silent classrooms for the engineers who would build the T-34 and for the soldiers who would carry it west to Berlin. Even now those rusting hulls remain, scattered across the forests of Karelia and the plains of Belarus, their rivets loosened, their paint long gone, their forms softened by moss and time. They no longer resemble weapons. They resemble memory. Each one marks a place where certainty met reality, and where the cost of progress was measured in lives rather than numbers. The T-26 story endures because it mirrors a larger truth, not just for the Soviet Union, but for every empire that confuses movement with meaning. Technology, without thought, becomes ritual. Power, without understanding, becomes blindness. The Red Army learned this lesson through fire, and in learning it, changed the course of the war. When the T-34 rolled into battle, It did so carrying the ghosts of the T-26 within its armor. Every curve of its hull, every angle of its armor, every improvement in its radio and engine bore the imprint of those who had fallen before. Progress was not born of triumph, but of humility. The T-26 began as a symbol of faith in the machine. It ended as a testament to the necessity of the mind. And as its rusting hulls sink slowly back into the earth, they remind us of what all great powers must one day learn, that steel is strong, but understanding is stronger. For in the end, the Red Army did not inherit victory from its machines. It earned it from its mistakes.